Good afternoon everyone, Country Flyboy here, and today, Flight Sim World Review. So Flight Sim World has officially come out of early access, and according to Dovetail has entered phase 2 of development. Now honestly, I was a bit surprised by this. I at first did not think Flight Sim World was truly ready to release fully. After giving it some thought, however, I do see the logic in the decision. Now I had faith in Flight Sim World from the beginning, and I thought Dovetail would be a bigger contender than people in the community were giving them credit for. When Flight Sim World released into early access, I maintain this was not bad, and depending on how Dovetail handled it, it would determine a lot. So many games have entered into early access, never to come out, it's easy to throw the whole idea to the wind. But there have been enough success stories to determine the signs of a good early access game. Transparency, regular real updates, communication, and promptness are the 4 things to look for, and Dovetail demonstrated all of these with Flight Sim World. Though honestly, I still don't think it was truly ready for a full release, but the statements Dovetail has made along with Flight Sim World's full release tell us why. In Phase 2, the updates are going to be spaced further apart. Over its early access period, Flight Sim World got updated very regularly, but now it's clear the things they plan on implementing will take longer than the things they currently have implemented, so there is some logic in the decision to release in full. But all of this is beside the point. Flight Sim World is out now, and today I'm here to review it. But before I do, I'm going to say this will be a very different review than what you may be used to from me. From 1, it's a video, not written. 2, it's posted on my own channel, not on FS Elite's website. And 3, and most important, since we're talking about a standalone application, I've decided to review Flight Sim World as a game, very differently from a Flight Sim add-on. I'm judging Flight Sim World as a standalone game, 100% stock, no mods, no DLC, no anything. Judging it based on how it stands on its own, assuming no DLC or mods will ever be put in it. I may make comparisons to other flight sims, specifically FSX and X-Plane, since they are Flight Sim World's main competitors. I am reviewing this as a standalone game, so people looking at it from the perspective of a flight sim or flight simmer, this video is not for you. I'm going to do another video detailing my thoughts on it as a flight simmer and from that perspective, so if you're here for that, there is a link in description. This review is written in a way that does not consider the things flight simmers may want to know. Disclaimer, I did not actually purchase Flight Sim World, nor did I receive a press copy from Dovetail. I was actually one of the people to win a copy of Flight Sim World during one of the giveaways. Now, with all the caveats out of the way, let's get started. Overall, I think the graphics are okay. They are not the best I have ever seen, even from a Dovetail game. Though honestly, the texture quality is what lets it down the most. It's not even that the textures are bad, it's just that they don't quite look real or look right. I'm mainly referring to things like asphalt, concrete, and other surfaces and building textures. Texture quality on the aircraft is very good, and pretty good on land class textures such as cities and fields, but the textures for paved surfaces such as asphalt, and for some of the buildings around the airport, they leave some to be desired. Though I do find the whole thing a little too bright for my liking. I would normally fix this by lowering the brightness in the graphics options, but sadly there is a distinct lack of advanced graphics options. We'll talk about that more later. As for audio, it's good. The engines have a nice rumble to them. Pitch and sound changes depending on the viewpoint relative to the aircraft. There's a nice background white noise that can be heard when the engines are off. Overall, I think the audio is done well enough. My biggest complaint in audio is the ATC system. It is very robotic. I feel like I'm talking to Hal on the radio.
Hello, Foxtrot, Hotel Bravo, traffic, Diamond, November, 5-2.
Content is probably the second most important thing for any video game, and that includes flight sims. As a great reviewer once said, it does not matter how big your game world is if it's filled with nothing. This is very true. Flight Sim World has 3 ways of playing it. Single player free flight, where the entire world is yours to explore. Dedicated missions, where there's a full flight school and some entertaining missions to play with. And then there's a multiplayer. In the missions, you have a specified objective you need to complete, and there's also a full flight school to get you up to speed on flying the planes. I recommend newcomers start there. In free flight, you have the entire world to explore, and when I say the entire world, I mean the entire fracking planet. Unlike other games, there's not a small island or areas, nor is it a scaled down representation of the world. No, it is a full-scale virtual model of the real world. Real cities, real airports, and real nav aids. There are essentially 3 levels of detail to any city or airport. Most cities fall into the lowest one, where you can generally tell it's a city and usually which city it is. But the buildings are all generic, and though they are properly placed, they won't look like their real-life counterparts. The next tier up is moderately detailed. This is where a few cities fall into. There will be model buildings placed accurately to their real-world locations, but the ground will still use generic textures and procedurally generated generic buildings to fill the gaps between the model ones. And lastly, there's a full, high-detailed city, where a good portion of the city's most iconic buildings are modeled, and there may be a satellite image as the ground texture. These cities are few and far between. This same level of detail applies to the airports too. Generally, your larger, busier airports are modeled somewhat accurately, but occasionally you find an airport out in the middle of the boonies that's modeled more detail than you might think it needs to be. The world is real scale. You can actually navigate using real-world techniques. You could even find where your house should be in the world, but don't expect it to actually be there. By the way, if it takes an hour for your chosen aircraft to fly between 2 points in real life, it takes an hour to do it here too. Time compression is available should you so desire. As a simulator, the vehicle selection is going to be a very important part. And sadly, this is where Flight Sim World suffers a bit. There's really only one area of aviation modeled, and that's general aviation. Piston engines in particular. There's no jets, turboprops, helicopters, or gliders to be found. And this is a big problem. It's probably what hurts Flight Sim World the most in content. Do note that while the aircraft are few, their detail is high. Most systems work on them, though not all work exactly like their real-world counterparts, and they all look and sound fantastic. You can have the planes spawn with their engines running, ready to go, or completely cold and dark, and you have to start them up. There's an interactive checklist to guide you in doing that, so don't worry. In addition to free flight, there are also a few missions for you to enjoy. I was only able to try out 2 or 3 in the time I had, but what I did try seemed pretty good. A few technical issues, and I do feel the missions are lacking in variety, however that may be due to the limited aircraft selection. Some technical issues I encountered were trigger volumes not being big enough. I missed one of them by less than a mile, and that was enough for it to say I failed the mission. It thought I had gotten lost, when in reality, I knew right where I was. It was my invisible co-pilot who got lost, despite the 4 very large screens telling us exactly where we were, and we had just passed Vancouver International, one quite large airport. I must have been flying with a male version of Azusa from Idolmaster. The bad part about that is I was following ATC instructions, so it seems the missions may have been built to a very high level of accuracy. A little too high, actually, but it was no big deal. Navigating in the missions is not hard, just make sure you're on point. Turn on that pointer and helper. We've covered free flight, we've covered missions. All that's left is the world. The world itself sadly feels a bit empty. There are famous landmarks and accurate buildings, but the feel of the world itself lacks immersion. There's a distinct lack of ocean traffic, and the air traffic leaves a lot to be desired. But probably an even bigger problem than this is the lack of things to do beyond flying from place to place. After you complete the missions and visit your favorite areas in Free Flight, you might as well uninstall right there because you've basically seen it all. There's nothing to really engage the player over a long term. Viewers of my channel know I have talked about this before, but I honestly feel what this sim really needs is a job system. American Truck Simulator shows just how engaging a job system can be. I'm not saying we need that exact thing in Flight Sim World. There are big differences between the way trucks operate and the way planes operate. In fact, it might even be better to compare Flight Sim World to its sibling, Train Sim World. Train Sim World had a feature called Service Mode. In that mode, you could take over any train as it ran its schedule along the route. It was quite fun. Not only were the AI trains running around, but you could take command of them or ride along. Now, something like this would be a nice way to replicate scheduled service like an airline. But seeing as there are no airlines in Flight Sim World, it's no surprise that that's not here either. But no job system at all really hurts the game. There's just no replayability or anything to hold anyone's attention over a long term. If you've played any other flight sim, then you will have no problem playing this one, especially if you've played any of Dovetail's previous flight sims or Microsoft's. Not only does Flight Sim World run off the same engine that ran FSX 10 years ago, it uses mostly the same controls. The control scheme is really easy to get used to, and although keyboard and mouse is all you need at minimum, I highly recommend getting a joystick of some kind. No need for an expensive HOTAS setup, a cheapo will work just as well. Just get a joystick that has a twist axis and throttle, as well as a few buttons, and you should be good. I did not test it, but game controllers should work as well, but an actual joystick is a far better option. All the same, I do recommend going through the key command list and setting a few things up. You're going to want to bind a key to left brake and right brake, which are unbound by default. Other keys I can recommend setting are pressurization. Other than that, just note the propeller pitch and fuel mixture controls and you're all set. Flying the aircraft themselves is quite nice. The planes all behave like they should, and there's no glaring issues in their physics. One slider you absolutely should max out is realism. I know it may be tempting for an inexperienced player to lower that slider thinking it makes things easier, but counterintuitively, lowering it gives you no favors. Word of warning, however, the aircraft in this game do not behave like they do in other games. This is a simulator after all, so there are things that to an inexperienced player may seem like a bug. But in actuality, it's not a bug and is functioning like it should. A common one is the left-turning tendencies experienced by single-engine aircraft. There is naturally some left-turning tendencies these types of aircraft have due to the big spinning metal fan bolted to the front of the plane. The UI is nice and clean, and I like it. It looks very similar to Train Sim World, which is no surprise given the naming. The UI is easy to navigate and understand. Simplicity seems to be the big focus in UI design with this title. This is both a good and a bad thing, however. On one hand, when selecting an aircraft, there's quite a bit of meaningful information presented alongside a picture of the plane, and using the Quick Edit feature, we can quickly select payload and fuel settings or failure settings. However, the downside of simplicity is that there's more buttons to deal with when you want to set things up more precisely, and you may not be able to set things up as much as you want. This is not too big a deal, however, except in one notable area, and that is the settings. There is a distinct lack of advanced options. I don't think I'm alone in saying that while simplicity is nice, for a PC game, you have to have advanced options in the settings. You can set the options on a general level, moderate, high, ultra, but you can't fine-tune things to get the exact mix you want. This is particularly bothersome in scenery, as since I can only make large changes, I can't fine-tune the less important parts in favor of frame rate. I also find there are some parts that are missing that I would really like to be there. For example, you can select the pilot voice. This is the voice used by your pilot in the ATC system. Which robot do you want to sound like? But you can't preview it from the menu, so you don't know what you're going to sound like until hearing it in game. Now, the performance is interesting. When maxing out all the settings, I got around 25 frames per second, which is shit. But keep in mind, I maxed everything out, and my rig is not as good as she used to be. I'm actually running on hardware that's below the minimum system requirements, so I'm really asking for it by maxing everything out like that. My normal benchmarking technique is to gauge performance at lowest and highest settings. So again, at everything maxed out, I got 25 frames per second. With everything turned down to 0, I get 120 frames per second. Your performance is really going to come down to your settings quite heavily, and this is where some more advanced graphic options would be handy. Flight Sim World is running off the same engine that ran Microsoft's FSX, and whilst it looks better in a lot of ways, FSX had a very similar issue where frame rate was closely linked to settings in hardware, even more so than other games. But FSX had advanced graphics options, so you could fine-tune every detail and get your preferred mix of graphics and frame rate. Once I balanced everything out, at least as best as I could, I got about 40 frames per second with occasional dips to 25 in detailed areas, which is much better. I can honestly say the two sliders that will affect frame rate the most is scenery and traffic. Graphic options don't really seem to affect things as much as you might think, but keep in mind, like most simulators, Flight Sim World is pretty CPU heavy. For overall, visuals and audio, I give them 8 out of 10. Pretty good, but some textures let it down. Content, 3 out of 10. Okay, but really feels like it's missing something to hold your attention over a long term. And the lack of aircraft and aircraft variety lets it down even more. Gameplay, 9 out of 10. Easy to learn, somewhat difficult to master, nothing convoluted. Know that, although it's easy to get into, to truly get good, it will take some dedication. Options and UI, 5 out of 10. Very clean, easy to navigate, but lacking in advanced options. Performance, 5 out of 10. It's pretty good, all things considered, but without advanced graphics options, fine-tuning is impossible. Overall, I find Flight Sim World to be a generally good game, let down in some areas, chiefly in content and options. Without advanced options, it's really difficult to tailor the settings to your taste, and there's not really enough content included in the base game to hold your attention beyond completing the missions. The good news is that although it's out of early access, Dovetail has made it clear they are going to continue to add things to the game, and hopefully given time, it will be a much better platform. However, that's the future and we live in the present, and presently, Flight Sim World is only a 6 out of 10.